With a population of almost 10 million people, situated near the Great Lakes and Midwestern part of the United States, Michigan is the car capital of the world. But it's kinda weird. One of the most searched things for Michigan is, are there real werewolves in Michigan? Anyways, grab a blanket, turn off your lights, and let's see if our three stories has anything to do with cars or werewolves. A boy and his footsteps. I've never had any paranormal experiences before, or perhaps I had never recognized them as one before, until about 1 year ago, which I believe was a true paranormal experience. Now, as I start to write this story, you need to know that I suffer from an illness that can sometimes give me hallucinations, but after having this illness for a long time, I can easily distinguish between hallucinations from the reality. They would always pop up if my medication went wonky or my pain level was up. I have a 100% confidence to be able to distinguish the two. Now, as I start my story, I was in Three Rivers, Michigan, visiting my boyfriend at the time. For the second time since our relationship started. We had been in a long-distance relationship for a couple of years, and due to work and our money situations, we only really saw each other once a year. I was a few days in visiting when I was talking with my boyfriend's brother about ghosts, because of a show that I saw. It was said to be based on real-life experiences, and it fascinated me. This is when the brother told me that their house was an old house, built a really long time ago. A lot of the houses were like that where he was. He then told me that a boy that once lived at the house committed suicide in the 1970s. Shocked and nervous, I laughed it off, telling him he was yanking my chain, but he swore it was true, and even stated that his friend had heard the little boy walking around. His house being so old creaked a lot, and you could hear everyone walking around and even tell where they were at. Later that night, I was snuggling with my boyfriend in his bed, and we started talking about ghosts. He then said the same thing as his brother, that a boy had committed suicide, and sometimes you could hear him walking in the hall during the night, playing. Startled and starting to get really frightened, I snuggled close to him and fell asleep. Now, this is the part things are getting strange. I not felt like I was asleep. I saw two figures standing over me, but they were black shadows. But I knew one of them was the boy my boyfriend and his brother was talking about. He was with an older man, and the older man was trying to show him something. I was paralyzed and could not move at all. I tried to wake up, but nothing was happening. The older man reached forward, putting his hand on my face. My body felt stiffened and I couldn't move. Desperation filled me as I tried to wake up even more. I could kind of understand what they were saying, but some of it was muffled. Then at last, darkness took me and I awoke, freaking out. Then I felt like someone was standing at the door, scared. I went downstairs because I was truly frightened to go back to sleep. It was around 3 a.m. in the morning. Then, I started to hear someone running in the halls. I froze, tense, not knowing what to do. I knew the brother was sleeping, as his room was next to my boyfriend's, and my boyfriend was still passed out, and his parents are downstairs asleep. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. I heard the footsteps go on for 10 minutes and then stopped. Every half an hour after that, I would hear him run. Then a few hours later, he stopped. I never heard him run again. This had never happened when I was at his house the first time I visited. Me and my boyfriend were going through a rough patch, and I believe that the negative energy enabled the ghosts. But it was truly frightening experience for me. My medication was regulated at the time, and when I talked to my boss, she said to go with my gut. My gut tells me that that dream was not a dream at all. I don't know what to think of that little boy. I do not think that the boy itself is a bad spirit, for he never hurt me. But as for that other mysterious spirit, I'm not quite sure on that one. A string of spooky events. For privacy purposes, certain names in my story have been changed. The events, however, are true. In the summer of 2011, my boyfriend, Nathan, this was before we were engaged and married, and I drove to the wedding of his sister Barbie to their fiancé Frank's house. An interesting fact about Frank is that he is a shaman. He spends his days training and teaching others how to hone in on their psychic abilities and how to use them with ease. Barbie, being a former student of Frank's, also teaches in his seminars and is currently training to become a shaman herself. Needless to say, Nathan and I were looking forward to our stay at their cabin, curious to meet Barbie's husband-to-be. When we finally arrived at their 2-story cabin, nestled in the Smoky Mountains, we were warmly greeted outside by Barbie and a few of her friends, also from Michigan, that had already made the trip to their home the previous day. With our luggage in hand, we climbed the wooden steps leading to their wraparound porch, where we were introduced to Frank, who was idly sitting in a rocking chair, taking a drag from his long cigarette. He appeared a tad older than we anticipated, looking to be in his late 60s and early 70s, especially compared to Barbie, who had just recently turned 21. Now, we had seen pictures of Barbie and Frank together on Facebook before our visit, so we were aware of the obvious age difference. However, it was still a bit startling, for a lack of a better word, to see the two next to each other in person. But love happens to all walks of life, I guess. The initial shocks of seeing Frank in person quickly faded, and we thoroughly enjoyed the rest of our evening catching up with Barbie and getting to know her kind elderly fiancé. The night itself was coming to a close, as everyone had begun to stretch their limbs and release long, bellowing yawns. Barbie's friends said their goodbyes and headed back to their hotels, while Nathan and I made our way down the hallway and into the guest bedroom. The head of the twin-size air mattress that was supplied for us was pushed up against the wall. Just on the other side of this wall was where Barbie's and Frank's room was located. After a bit of situating Nathan and I, we positioned ourselves comfortably in the small air-filled bed, and were ready to drift away into a pleasant and much-needed slumber, until, that is, we heard screaming. At first, the only thing that could be heard was our slow, relaxed breathing and the creaking of the crickets outside. But after about 10 minutes, a very low and muffled sound of crying could be heard. Initially, I thought perhaps Frank and Barbie were watching some television show before they went to sleep, but then I remember that there was no television set in their room. I kept quiet for a while, listening carefully to the grief-stricken sobbing as other strange noises started to join in. A chilling chorus of screaming, a cluster of different voices yelling and talking to what I believe would be each other, and a flurry of different gruntings and growls. These noises persisted throughout the whole night, making it rather hard to sleep, and unfortunately, since these noises sounded so muffled, almost like trying to listen to a punk rock concert with your head underwater, I couldn't make out any audible words or phrases at all. I finally managed to squeeze in a few hours of sleep until the next morning, when I discovered Nathan had too heard the cluster of creepy sounds. We talked about it for a short while discussing what it could have been or where it may have come from, trying to be as logical as one could be after hearing such things. However, we just couldn't come up with a solid explanation. Every single night we stayed there, which was only 4 nights, we heard the same spooky nonsense. Sometimes later during our visit, Barbie and Frank briefly talked about being in tune with the spiritual realm and how many different spirits resided inside their home. But this was just a brief conversation, and Nathan and I weren't fully comfortable disclosing what we had heard to Barbie and Frank just yet. Yes, there is a reason for that. When our time visiting Frank and Barbie came to an end, we packed our bags and headed home. The trip back was a grueling 18-hour drive, and by the time Nathan dropped me up at my house, I was ready to do infinite cartwheels around my yard. I was just glad to be out of the car. Everything seemed fine for the first few days being back home. Nothing out of the ordinary. Until one particular night. My parents' house has an attached garage. This is where everyone that comes over or lives there enters. Once you enter through the garage and into the house, you would be in the kitchen. The door to my former basement room is in the kitchen, directly across from the door that leads to the garage. If you walk through the kitchen past my bedroom door, you would be in the dining room. Once in the dining room, you'd be able to see into the living room straight on. And to your right would be the hallway where the bathroom, my brother's bedroom, and the door that leads to my parents' bedroom upstairs is located. Okay, now back to the story. One night at around 2 a.m. in the morning, I was chatting on the phone with Nathan while relaxing on my bed as was usual. We were near the end of our conversation for the night when I heard the door handle to the garage jiggle and rattle as if someone was trying to get in. My bed was located right next to the stairs that lead up to the kitchen and to the entrance of the garage, so I was normally the first one to hear anyone come in, since that door was rather creaky and rather loud. I was startled to hear the door open because I knew my older brother, who worked a third shift job, was still at work, and I knew that my parents were asleep in their rooms on the second story. My head was racing. I panicked, thinking someone was trying to break in. I knew I had locked the handle and deadbolt to that door, a nightly habit of mine, right before I started talking on the phone with Nathan. What's worse was the sound of the heavy footsteps I heard above my head through the floorboards of the main story of the house. At that moment, I started to feel my adrenaline rush as I dashed for the handle of one of my swords and began to quietly sneak up the stairs. Nathan was still on the line while the phone dangled between my shoulder and chin. I must have looked completely silly, adorned in Napoleon Dynamite's PJs and all. When I reached the main floor, I could see that the garage door entrance was in fact opened, and upon looking out the kitchen window, I could see that my brother's car was still missing from the driveway. This verified that he was still at work and not at home. Once I left my bedroom, I no longer heard footsteps walking about, so I took a deep breath and raced for my parents' bedroom door. When I did, I ran up their stairs and just about gave them a heart attack, exclaiming, "Someone's in our house!" My dad then opened the safe, grabbed his handgun, and investigated the house. When he returned, he said he found no trace of anyone breaking in. No other doors were opened. Everything seemed in its place, and nothing was broken. Nothing was missing. Even the entrance door of the garage was closed and locked again. I think my parents wanted to believe me, but they just ended up trying to comfort me and told me to try to get some sleep. They were both exhausted from working the previous day and were a bit too tired to entertain my supposed fit of hysteria. So I did as I was told and retreated to my bedroom, where I disclosed all that happened to Nathan, who was still on the line and was terribly confused and worried. I knew what I had heard, and I knew what I saw. The door did open, and something was stomping around the house. There was no convincing me otherwise. It was my resolve. Things did not stop there. For the next few weeks that followed, I found myself continuously waking up at the same time each night, roughly between 1:30 a.m. and 2 a.m., to the sound of gut-wrenching sobs. This crying was terrible. It sounded as if someone was mourning the recent loss of a child or something like that, incredibly loud and sorrowful. The first time I heard the weeping, it sounded as if it was coming through the vents in my ceiling. It had a female ring to it, which led me to believe that it was my mother who was crying. So of course I ran up the 2 sets of stairs to my mother's side to see what was wrong, only to find both of my parents sound asleep. Riddled with confusion, I gently nudged my mom awake and asked if she had been crying at any time that night. Her answer was always no, and went on to ask me if something was wrong. She could tell I was a bit shook up. I told her what I heard, and she suggested that I pray and go back to bed. This crying lasted every night for about 3 weeks, like I mentioned before. And every single time I heard it, I would inspect the house for clues, hoping to find the source of the crying. I was never really able to reach a conclusion on this incident, although the crying always reminded me of the crying I heard at Barbie's house at night. The same pitch, the same ghastly sounding wails. The last and final strange occurrence I underwent at my parents' house was a few days before my wedding, in the middle of the day. My mom and I were preparing to go last-minute wedding shopping to pick up any small odds and ends we may have forgotten or might need. She was all ready to go, sitting patiently in the driver's side of the car, engine running, radio blasting, where, as I still prancing about my bedroom was picking out my outfit for the day, I was well aware that I was the only person inside of the house at that moment. My dad was at work, my brother was at a friend's house, and of course, my mom was in the car outside. I was just about finished putting myself together when I went to grab a scarf from my walk in the closet. As I stood there fixing the scarf around my neck, I heard a male voice say directly in my ear, "Hey!" I quickly turned around to find nothing behind me. My eyes frantically scanned the room looking for signs of anyone else that could be in the room with me. Even though I knew my dad and brother were gone, I still called for their names over and over and over again, checking to make sure that I wasn't being teased, I wasn't being pranked. Sure enough, there was no reply from either of them, again verifying to me their absence. I checked all the corners of rooms and any possible hiding spots and couldn't find anything or anyone. I started to shake a little, as I often do when I'm spooked, and continued to grab my things so I could leave. When I walked back inside my closet to grab my jacket, I immediately heard loud, heavy breathing, almost like a growl, all around me. At that point, I ran like hell up the stairs and into the car, where I vigorously fought off an oncoming panic attack. I can't say for sure what was going on in those last few months I lived with my parents. All I know is that after my junior high experiences ended, nothing paranormal ever happened in that house until I got back from my trip. A sweet goodbye. Perhaps I'm being overly generous with my assumptions of who this being was, but everything I'm about to type is true. I was 17 years old when this happened. It was the early months of 2007. First, a bit of backstory. My mom's late partner had passed away from brain cancer in the beginning of November '06. Her and I had been very close, kindred spirits of sorts. It's simple to say her death was difficult for me. I had a hard time accepting it and made a bit of a scene at the funeral. And seeing her in the coffin, it was too much. Time passed and the pain relieved. Still, I was depressed. I missed my cheesehead buddy. Things didn't feel the same around the house anymore, but I figured, and still do, that it was just getting used to the absence. My experience is simple and it's short. It was late in the afternoon one day in March or possibly April. I remember it was very cold outside, but glaringly sunny. I had no blinds for my windows in my room, and the window was closed, making it very warm and dry. I was laying in my bed, not sleeping, just being a lazy teenager. I was sticky with sweat, hot, but I didn't want to get up to open the window at all. In the distance, I could hear my mom in the kitchen cooking dinner, and I was thinking about how I didn't want to eat either. Laying on my stomach, my arms above my head, wrapped around my pillow, I heard a raspy whisper voice say, "Psst," and then call my name. But it wasn't my real name, rather a nickname that only my mom's partner had ever called me. It made me jump right up because the voice was right next to my left ear. I was too hesitant to look over. And then I felt something touch my left arm. It was a soft touch, like a finger poke. My whole forearm was chilled and I had actual goosebumps. All the hairs were standing up. I looked and I was alone. I felt much more at peace after that. Anyways, thanks for reading. It's a special memory and I just wanted to share it.